All right. Thank you, Jen. And good to see so many friends and familiar faces here. It's great to have you all together today to talk about this topic about really how we measure success. So I'm going to throw some slides up here. And as Jen mentioned, we will have time for questions, so please put them in the chat and we will get to as many as we can. If we don't get to them, I am happy to answer questions afterwards. And you can reach me by my email, shuman@igc.org. The design of this webinar came about when about 2 months ago, I got an invitation from some colleagues in Paris who run a think tank called Utopies, and they wanted me to come to Paris and talk with some of their audience about what were the strengths and weaknesses of the local economy movement in the United States. So, in preparation for that, I wrote a piece in the Main Street Journal which was called a report card on the U.S. local economy movement. And by the way, I encourage all of you to subscribe to the Main Street Journal. Well, I love it if you're a paid subscriber. Most people are not. Most people get it for free. And we have 8,000 subscribers, and we need every single one of you in our subscription feed. So, after writing this article about a report card, a bunch of people then said, well, if we want to measure success in our movements in the United States, how would we do so? And I thought about that, and it's related, but a little bit different than the report card. So, really, this talk should be called Two Report Cards, because what I'd like to do is just briefly go over, for those who haven't read it, what my evaluation of the local economy movement in the United States is, and then we will go to the a bunch of measures that I think all of you could really start using in your own work. So, um, what the way that I want to organize this as a SWOT, right? And a SWOT looks at strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So, in the strengths category, I think it's fair to say that we have won the war of ideas. And when I say the war of ideas, I mean the war against traditional economic development, which is built around the attraction and retention of non-local business. There have literally been hundreds of studies at this point to show the superior contribution of locally owned businesses to all kinds of metrics: jobs, income, wealth, diversity and equality, social peace, tourism, ecological well-being. So congratulations, we have won. The second thing that I would say is that we have really changed the investment environment in the United States. Now, not as far and as fast as many of us would like, but still the successes are important. And a bunch of us helped to change the securities law of the United States with the passage of the Jobs Act in 2012. And just looking at the metric of investment crowdfunding, the current statistics are something like 2.5 million people have invested $3 billion in about 10,000 companies. And the average company engaged in crowdfunding is raising about $350,000. The average investor is putting in more than $1,000. The most successful businesses are those run by women and people of color who were systematically excluded from the capital universe previously. So I think that is a pretty big success that we can be proud of. A third area of success is community wealth building. And community wealth building now involves many organizations, but I think it's reasonable to call out the uh, Democracy Collaborative led by Stephanie McKinney. And community wealth building really says we need to look at new forms of ownership like cooperatives or employee ownership trusts. We need to focus on anchor institutions because if we can mobilize their purchasing power, their investment power, their hiring power, it can jumpstart a moribund economy. And we have some really good examples of success, both in Cleveland in the United States and in Preston in the United Kingdom, where local procurement was increased from about 5% to 20% and made huge differences in the well-being of that community. And variations on community wealth building are now being used in hundreds of cities around the world. Another strength worth pointing out is the focus on antitrust. And this goes deep in American history. I think it's fair to say, if you look at the Boston Tea Party, the United States was founded on killing monopolies. And kudos to Stacy Mitchell and her team at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance in helping to organize many organizations, labor unions, and other groups around antitrust, around lawsuits, around new pieces of state and national legislation, around efforts to move the politics of this so that you even now have some conservatives like Senator Josh Hawley from Missouri interested in this. The last thing that I'll call out as a pocket of strength is that there are a dozen business networks in the United States that are just really impressive. And some of you are on the call right now. You know who I'm talking about. One example of this is, of course, Local First Arizona, which as an organization has 60 full-time staff people. They have 2,700 dues-paying members, a directory of 6,000 businesses that's statewide, an active Move Your Money campaign that has involved local banks and credit unions. They have an accelerator, a boot camp, a kitchen incubator, a microloan program. They have shifted procurement policy in the city of Phoenix. They have shifted tax policy on Amazon in the state. It's a model that I think all of us can and should aspire to. All right, that's the good news. Now, the weaknesses. And as we move into weaknesses, uh, not all of you are going to agree with my uh, views about this, and that's part of the fun of this, that I think I invite all of you to kind of think about what would be on your SWOT evaluation, because it may differ a lot from mine. But from my vantage point, the overall performance of local business networks has not been very good over the last 10 years. I pulled this slide out from about 15 years ago, and this was a slide that at the time, 2010, it was about Bali Business Alliance for Local Living Economies, and it says the Bali network has 20,000 members, 20,000 business members affiliated with 200 local business alliances. And the truth of the matter is that most of these business networks have disappeared. And you could look at this and fairly say that this and we are a movement on decline. Now, why has that happened? One reason is that I think that the standard model that was promoted for local business networks was one around promoting fundraising, fundraising, individual fundraising, begging for grants from local and state government. And I'm not saying that these things are bad, but if this is your source of finance, it is going to be good one year and bad the next, and you're not going to survive for very long. And this is why in the book, The Local Economy Solution, I wrote about 27 models of local businesses that can and should anchor various kinds of business networks. And you'll find in the book, for example, successful credit unions, successful local investment funds, successful schools for business people. All of these things generate revenue and provide different ways of doing the work. The third thing that I would finger here is that many of the people who came to run business alliances were not business people, but activists. And that's fine. I mean, we need whoever we can to propel these networks forward. But the truth of the matter is that when you're organizing a business network, you're going to have a bunch of people with very diverse political views. And I feel like it is incumbent on us to have as broad a political tent as possible in the organizing that we do. Now, at least one person who read my report card misunderstood this point as saying that you should be apolitical. That is not what I'm saying. My point is that you need to be attentive to the politics of the businesses in your community. And so the politics of a local network in Cambridge, Massachusetts are going to look very different than those in Livingston, Texas. The last weakness I would say is that we are like a old high school class in a rural town that has never moved on. I mean, you know how like people in a small community, they, friends come and go, but enemies accumulate. And it's really because people remember all of the slights, all of the disappointments that they had earlier on. And we really are kind of as a movement a lot like Yugoslavia, uh, with a bunch of warring ethnic factions with one another. And the movement has become more fragmented in the last 10 years. Here's my advice. If you're not into therapy, just reach out to someone you have a bad relationship with in the movement, make your peace, and start working together. All right. Opportunities. Opportunities. There are vast opportunities here. I recently finished a study for the mayor of Irvine, Larry Agron, about what localization of the energy system in Irvine might look like. And it's quite a detailed paper, and Jen will put in the chat how you can get a copy of it. But the bottom line is this, is over the next 20 years, the good citizens and businesses of Irvine, which has 330,000 people, by the way, it's not a small town, will be paying in electricity bills to Southern California Edison something like $60 billion. The cost of solarizing the entire city in a way that completely unplugs from Southern California Edison is about 16 billion. So spending 16 billion to save 44 billion, I see a business opportunity. And what the paper puts forward is a revolving loan fund paying 7% that could easily get this solarization done in the next 20 years. Now, honestly, this kind of policy can and should be done in every community that we operate in. And I believe this should be a fundamental building block for the kind of localization work that we do. A second opportunity is devolution. And, you know, there is a deep tradition in the United States around decentralization. I mean, that is why the United States has states, has a 10th Amendment. It was Thomas Jefferson, who articulated this idea of a decentralized country. It was in the writings of Thoreau. It was in the economic analysis of Henry George in the late 1800s, and then became more popularized by E.F. Schumacher. And that's why I have the picture here of Susan Witt from the Schumacher Center for New Economics, because they have been one of the great promoters of decentralized economics. A third opportunity is that right now, when you start to articulate what a policy and political agenda for decentralism would look like, it looks really different than the Democrats and the Republicans. And to give you one specific example, we've got a situation right now where both Democrats and Republicans believe in heavily subsidizing big business, big data centers, big Amazon warehouses. It's just a matter of degree. We, on the other hand, are advocating get rid of those subsidies and focus on local businesses. And the fact that neither party is paying much attention to us, I see as an opportunity, because we can start creating a little bit of a healthy competition to say, if you want our support, you're going to need to move closer to some of our policy positions. The last opportunity I want to call out is that we have all kinds of wonderful leadership. Again, many of our wonderful leaders are on this call. But what I have seen, and I think all of us have seen over the last 25 years, is a movement that is becoming less male, it is becoming less white, and hopefully with a little work, it can become a little less elderly, like people like me. I have the picture here of Alonda Williams, who's one of the heads of B Lab. And to me, and many of the pictures I've shown have been of non-white women leaders in the movement who I think we can bring up. Threats. So threats, threats are come from multiple places. And in my view, the most important threats that we're seeing are, first of all, from fascism. Fascism of the right, but honestly, fascism from the left, if we were living in Venezuela or North Korea, would be just as problematic. The problem with fascism is that it believes in eliminating checks and balances in the name of authoritarian rule, and it believes in aligning with large corporations. And that's kind of what we're facing right now. And both of those elements of authoritarianism are at odds with our vision of a decentralized democracy and a focus on small business. Second threat, of course, is climate disasters. Uh, and I don't need to dwell on this except to say if you want a motivation to move faster on investing in solarization in your community, this is a very good reason. And then the last threat that I'd like to just point out is the threat of war. Threat of war. And this is an administration that came to power promising an end to wars. Instead, we've had a bunch of new ones. And, as I've written about, some elements of these wars are actually very good for us. I mean, no one has done more to hasten the adoption of solar energy than the Trump administration by having a stupid war with Iran, raising the price of oil, and expediting people's desire to get away from it. But war has lots of negative consequences, including death and suffering. And these kinds of consequences have second and tertiary effects that we're not going to like. All right, so that is more or less what I put up as a SWOT analysis a couple of weeks ago. What I want to shift to now is to say, okay, if you want to do more of an evaluation of your own networks in the United States, what are some objective yardsticks you might have? You could do a subjective thing like I did, but I think it's worthwhile to hold ourselves accountable and ask, what are the impacts that we are having on our community? And I'd like to suggest that there are at least 12 indicators that are worth looking at. Now, these indicators are just suggestive, but I have tried to focus on indicators that we can measure. So, first of all, a couple of things about indicators. Indicators are best if they are quantifiable, not do you feel like your community is getting better? Do you feel like the local business environment is better? No, none those questions really are not terribly quantifiable. But quantifying what is the number of new local businesses that we've had this year, that is quantifiable. The second is that we want to focus on indicators that are robust. And what I mean by robust is counting the number of German Shepherds in your community is going to be less important than counting the number of crowdfunding transactions. And the last thing, which most indicator projects forget, is that the assembly of indicators has to be affordable. Because if you have a special indicators project, you've raised $200,000 to do it in year one, and year two comes and you didn't get a renewal of your grant, your indicator project is dead in the water. And honestly, that is what has happened with a lot of good indicator projects. So we need indicators that are relatively inexpensive and relatively easy to put together. And that is largely what I'm going to be suggesting here. So I want to first start with some easy measures of your community's economic success. And one easy measure is of median income. Median income is income at the 50th percentile of your community. And median income is different than mean income. Average income is a problematic number because Elon Musk could move into your community and greatly increase the mean. But Elon Musk would have no influence on median income. So you want to see this indicator rise. Second thing is inequality. It's easy to look at income. It's easy to look at gross regional product, but it's hard to look at the impacts on inequality. And there is one measure that I want to introduce everyone here to, as I do with my economics students at the Bard Green MBA program, called the Gini coefficient. And the idea of the Gini coefficient is that if you assemble a graph like this and have on one axis the cumulative portion of income and on another axis the cumulative percentage of the population, And this green line here represents perfect equality. But if you start plotting where people are in your community, you realize you wind up on a line below the green line. And the more area that there is in A1, um, that is going to change, that is going to mean a greater level of inequality. So we have this thing called the Gini coefficient, which looks at the relationship of A1 to the whole triangle. And if you want to look up the Gini coefficient, you can do so. So I live in Southern California. I live in Riverside County, and I looked up with the census what the Gini index for inequality was for my county. And I could do this for a zip code or for a community, and it has the estimate of 0.43. By the way, as that number gets larger, there's greater inequality. As that number gets smaller, there's less inequality. And I could do this for year after year after year. And I encourage everyone here to get copies of the slides when we're done, because what I did is I included in here, if you go to the census, you can construct tables like this by looking at certain databases. So in this particular database, it is B19083. And that will help to call up the Gini index, and then you can do it. This was for 2024. You could do it for 2023, 2022, 2021, and see what the pattern is for inequality in your community. The third easy macro indicator is looking at local jobs, right? And what do I mean by local jobs? Well, here's the thing. If we kind of created a little bit of a table here on publicly traded companies, large corporations, small and medium corporations, publicly owned companies, nonprofits, cooperatives, partnerships, sole proprietorships, we can tease out that all but the first two are 99% locally owned. And it really doesn't matter what our peculiar definition of local ownership it is, because they're small enough and have a small group of investors behind them that they're truly locally owned. It's only when we get into larger corporations that are they're likely non-local, or we can get to publicly traded companies, which by definition are non-local. So the question is, when you look at all the jobs in your economy and add up all the jobs in these, bottom one, two, three, four, five, six categories, how do they compare to the overall increase in jobs in your community? And one way you can do this is, again, go to the census, and this particular census tab here is CB 2300 CPB, and you can pull up in a given location, and again, I did this for Riverside County, all establishments with less than 5 employees, 5 to 9, 10 to 19, and so forth. And as you get to the larger businesses, the numbers get smaller, and you can see exactly who they are and make some judgments about whether or not they fit in the locally owned category. But the idea here is you want an indicator that tries to measure what percentage of jobs are in locally owned companies. And as that percentage gets higher, your community and your work is getting better. Another easy macro measure is the brain drain, particularly relevant in smaller rural communities. And what happens in these communities is that the best and the brightest, often young people, when they see no economic prospects, they leave town and they'll go to a nearby bigger city. And this is a problem. And I think from a standpoint of a local business network, you want to figure out ways of increasing the probability that someone with a great business idea can find finance support and implement that business in your community rather than split town. Um, and there's another census data track, S0101, which shows you, what the total population is again from Riverside County. And we can look at under 5 years, 5 to 9, and so forth. So I can see what the total number of people, say, under 18 is. And if I do this year by year, I can see whether that number is increasing or decreasing and draw some inferences about the brain drain. The last relatively easy macro measure is looking at small business survival rates. We're told that the typical small business that gets started will close in 4 or 5 years. And, what we want to do is make it more likely that any small business that gets started survives. Now, this is tricky to do with the census. And if you can afford it, there is a website called youreconomy.org, which uses Dun& Bradstreet data to really get into the weeds, and you can do the weeds at a zip code level about what has changed in establishments, who's moved in, who's moved out, what are changes in jobs. But you also, with a little bit of work, and I'm not going to go into the details here, you can construct this out of census data as well. And there is a census category called the business dynamic set, BDS. And while you can't get it down to the zip code level, in this case, you could, I did a chart on California, and what it shows is, say, in manufacturing, firms by different levels of their age. And that can be helpful in your creating a story about whether your business survival rates are improving or deteriorating. Probably the hardest thing for you to construct, and still very important for you to do if you can do so, is to measure economic leakage. And the reason economic leakage matters is that every dollar that leaves your community in a purchasing or an investment transaction does not have any multiplier effect, does not contribute to income, wealth, and jobs. Now, there are advanced technologies, softwares. I use Implan. REMI is another one. RIMS2 is somewhat cheaper from the Bureau of Economic Affairs. But these things require some expertise to use, and Implan and REMI have become unbelievably expensive. So I do think there is a cheap and fast way for you to get some insights around the leakage in your community. And what I encourage you to do is compare the way in which jobs are laid out in your economy compared to the United States as a whole. And the basic premise of this is the United States as a whole is a pretty self-reliant country. I mean, our exports and imports are about 10% of our gross domestic product. Um, which is very unusual for countries around the world. And the consumption patterns in one part of the country do not differ that dramatically from consumption patterns in other parts of the country. So in this column here, which I derive from this, so this is again comes from census. So it's the American Community Survey dash and then DPO3. And here are a bunch of sectors, big picture sectors in the economy. And if you look at US jobs, actually, should say 2024, not 2021. Correction there. I'll fix that before we send out the slides. And here is how employment breaks down in these categories across the United States. And you see, for example, agriculture, under 2%, retail is about 11%, professional, scientific, and management services close to 13%. Healthcare has been a huge area of growth. So we have 23% in education, healthcare, and social assistance. Arts, entertainment, recreation, this is tourism. This is about 9%. Um, Note that manufacturing is 10% and falling. And falling, by the way, all over the world, but that's another conversation. What I want to point out is that if you do these simple layout of percentages for your own city, again, using this database DPO3, what you can see is the percentage of jobs that I have in, say, retail trade greater or less than the US as a whole? If it is greater than the US as a whole, then chances are very good that my retail leakage number is going to be small. But if it is 5% of the jobs rather than 11% of the jobs, it means there are very few retail employees in my community, and instead, people are likely leaving the community and going to neighboring communities to do their retail transactions. So, same thing with finance. If I see a finance number that's 3% and the average is 6.7% for the United States as a whole, I know that my banking sector, my securities sector, my commodities trading sectors, all of these financial institutions are smaller than the average. And it means that people in my community are likely going to some other bigger city to do their finance work. All right, now let's talk about easy measures that you won't get from the census, but easy measures that you can do on your own and your network should do on their own. So we know that B Corps and benefit corps are one of the most common ways that businesses try to aspire to higher standards, standards with respect to workers, the environment, to community. We can find out what B Corps are in our community by looking at the directory of B Corps on the B Lab site. We can find out through our state whether or not there are benefit corporations. Consider that's really benefit corporation, consider it B Corp light, and more than 40 states have benefit corporation statutes. We can find out how many of those are in our community. And the point is that the more of these companies that are in our midst, and the more that we can link other businesses to these exemplary companies, we know we're doing something right in improving the quality of business life in our community. Two other easy measures suggested by the critique I said earlier. One is, what is the size of your business network? Both your dues-paying members and maybe other members that are not paying dues, but nevertheless you put in a directory. And I'm going to challenge you to look at non-grant support that you get for your work. Because the more you can sell goods and services like other businesses to create a steady revenues flow, the more likely you're going to be here for a long time. Another thing you might measure is the number of crowdfunding investments. How many businesses in your community have launched investment crowdfunding campaigns? And you can get these data from the SEC or from King's Crowd. We publish lists every other week in the Main Street Journal about crowdfunding, so you get some sense of what's going on in your backyard. And better still, are there one or two local investment funds that people can invest in your community? That would be another indicator of success. Another thing that would be easy for you to identify, but this has sort of the opposite meaning, is how many corporate attractions has your economic development authority successfully gotten that year? Because what they call a success is honestly a failure for your community, and it's a failure for the local business environment, and it's a failure for your network. So if there are no corporate attractions that are working, congratulations. You're doing very well as a community. If you have a bunch of corporate attractions, you are wasting a boatload of money on a form of economic development that doesn't work. The last one that I'll mention, and this is hard to do, but not impossible, is to look at your local government's procurement pattern. So this guy here is Tim Keller. He is the mayor of Albuquerque, New Mexico. Before he was mayor, he was the state auditor. And he did one of the best studies in the country looking at state and local procurement patterns in New Mexico on food. How much of the food that's being served at everything from schools to University of New Mexico to hospitals to prisons, how much of that food is coming from New Mexico farmers? And surprise, that number was tiny, which itself was a revelation. It requires probably some act by your local government to demand that this kind of study be prepared. But finding out, where this largest anchor institution is spending its money can be very helpful in determining whether your work is succeeding. Now, I'll say finally that there are 100 other indicators that I could plausibly recommend to you. And part of the fun of doing this is sorting out which are the indicators that would be most meaningful for people in your community and have the most importance. Um, but what I suggest is that, you take this on as a kind of community project. Present to people in your network a bunch of different plausible indicators and start doing it. And even if the city is uninterested in carrying out these indicators, you can do it yourself and make yourself very useful to the community in seeing what kind of progress you're making. So I am going to stop there, and Jen, we can open it up for some questions.
Absolutely. And we do have a lot of questions. So I just want to acknowledge Jim's been holding up his hand for minutes and minutes. So thanks for doing that. But I'm gonna call on Kat Raz, who had a question, and a couple other people, and I'll open it up to Jim. Kat, you want to ask your question online?
Oh yeah, thank you. And thank you, Jen, for inviting me last minute. I made it. Michael, I've emailed you previously about looking at indicators that tell the number of businesses that actually own their buildings. And for reference, I live in Tacoma, Washington. I actually reached out to Jen because we have nothing here. There's no local first. We cannot participate in a funded Main Street program. There is no support for local business here. And what we have in the absence of that is a bunch of real estate companies, like buying up all the buildings, promoting local businesses, but we don't actually have a grassroots organic local business organization, and there's no funding for small business here. So on the one hand, I'm trying to organize a bunch of people in Tacoma to do a local first or a business alliance and trying to figure out what are the first steps and how to do that. So that may be also a thing to like take offline. But the other question I have for you about indicators is I've been on this trip for 18 months I truly believe that those of us who own Main Street businesses, storefront businesses, retail, restaurant, light manufacturing, we all used to own the buildings. The only reason to continue to do this with the low margins and the low pay is that you're making an investment over time in the real estate. And as it has become more and more difficult because of the erosion of banking since Regal Neal in the 90s, is that we can't get the loans. And owner occupants specifically, it's so difficult to get loans to purchase our buildings when we own the business that's in the building. I would spend the back half of my career researching this to try to prove that it's true, but I really believe that more people who own small business in their communities used to own the real estate and they don't anymore. So do you have thoughts on either of those two things? One, how to start a local organization, but also like what are the easy ways to start going through longitudinal data or data that's available through census or like your parcel maps and that kind of thing to say people used to own these buildings and now we just have like ghost businesses that are renting for 5 years and then go out of business.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot in there, and I'll just say briefly, I think trying to create some kind of indicator that measures the percentage of local businesses that do own or partially own their buildings could be a very interesting measure of financial health. Uh, I would need to think about this problem a little bit before I could say here is the right tool for doing so. Probably, and one underlying message of what I laid out here is that if you have some resources, there are all kinds of tools you can buy to measure this stuff. And if you don't have resources, you have to really play with census and other kinds of publicly available data like that to get at this. Um, so there is a way you could do it, right? You could go through the property listings in your local property office and see who owns what and see how they line up. And you could start with a couple of commercial districts and maybe expand from there. You also could just do a survey among businesses that are in your network and get some information that way. Um, but it's going to be slow going. And I do think that setting up investment institutions that make it possible for more businesses to own their properties. So, as I'm looking at the screen here, I see Jessica David, who has an investment fund in Rhode Island, and this is not the only purpose of her fund, but one of the purposes of her fund. And so looking at local return might be an interesting way of your thinking about this problem. Jim, let's go to you.
Sorry, I must have pressed the wrong button. Sorry, but
Oh, you're
Oh,
good.
okay.
I'm going to
Okay.
be rude and pop in here because my question was along these same lines. Is that okay, Jen? Okay. Um, I was interested in residential investment and home ownership because I think interest payments and debt for housing is a huge source of leak. And in communities like Eugene, where we have a huge unhoused population and unaffordable housing, that's got to be a huge indicator. And I'm curious that one, that you didn't address that at all, and two, how would we?
Yeah, well, I think it's a good indicator, and it is relevant in a lot of communities. I mean, and there's lots of ways of looking at it, right? I mean, yes, the unhoused population is one, and what the changes are year in, year out. Another way of looking at it is what is the commute time for people who are working in your community? And as that commute time goes up, then it's evidence that people have not been able to find affordable housing locally and have had to move elsewhere. Um, but uh, I would say that being proactive about it, yeah, trying to figure out a bunch of tools that can promote local investment in housing especially affordable housing, is important. I mean, in the Main Street Journal, we put a lot of attention not into the Ezra Klein universe of how do you bust through licensing issues. To me, that's almost a red herring. But we spend a lot of time focused on how do you create different forms of housing, like cooperative housing, or housing on public land, or housing with unusual ownership um, trajectories so that your rental payments can ripen into equity. So, what are tools for expediting people's ability to move from renter into owners? That to me, I think, is a really good thing to focus on.
Thank you. Ann Stapleton, you had a couple of questions. Can you narrow it down to one? We'd love to hear at least one, and hopefully we'll have time to get another one too.
Well, gosh, I have all the questions, that's kind of my thing. So, any thought on which would be of interest to other folks?
I think just what is coming to mind right now. You had a lot. Yep.
Okay. I personally am really interested in regional networks. Um, And what would that be a way to help build common goals and lower the sort of greenhouse effect of the personal grievances in business networks? What if you're across state lines or county lines in a regional network? Will that help sort of moderate the temperature? Any examples?
Well, I think in principle, you're probably right. And especially, I mean, what I have seen is sectoral related groups. Um, so where, for example, well, one of the best examples of this is in Wisconsin, and there's a region in Wisconsin where they have a bunch of business incubators, and I mean, literally, you would have to travel thousands of miles to go to all of them because these are fairly remote rural areas. But they do have online um, communities of practice together that bring together, say, food producers or real estate developers or, people creating dental practices or whatever, which I think is a really useful thing to do. Um, I've, you know, I've seen this informally. I mean, for example, a few years back, I did a lot of work with tribal networks, with the Northwest Area Foundation, and they work with tribal reservations all the way from the Pacific Coast to Minnesota. And, again, we set up communities of practice to bring together those reservations that are, say, starting grocery stores, or communities of practice with those reservations doing small scale meat processing. So I think that there is something to that, and it does, yeah, it does. Those personal relationships do bring down some of the competitiveness. But let me go further and suggest what I mean by what we need to do to bring down jealousies. I would like to see a local economy cooperative where every nonprofit actor in the country is a member of that. And those co-ops, have democratic methods of electing people, but there is an understanding that we're all sitting around the same table, working on the same objectives, and we start to figure out in that kind of model how we allocate resources and time more effectively. I don't have an easy way of getting from here to there, although now I'm looking at Elias Krim, who spends a lot of his time doing that. But I challenge all of you to think about how to make that happen.
Principle 6.
Cooperatives. Yep. Jennifer, certified naturally grown. You have lots of questions relating to local food economies. Can you pick one? We'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I'm just really curious if you have any examples. I'm going to get your book, but especially about building local food economies. I think all the indicators you mentioned are great and that will be super useful, but curious if you have anything on that.
Oh, do I plenty of that. So 15 years ago, I and the Wallace Center for Sustainable Ag, we did a big study for the Kellogg and the Gates Foundation called Community Food Enterprises. And the study was all about, let's look at 24 examples of really successful local food businesses, half in the US, half internationally, and try to understand how they have made small economies of scale successful. And there's lots of good stuff in there that's still relevant, even though, the case studies, most of them need to be updated. Um, I think if I fast forward a little bit, I've done some work over the last year with a group called Warehouses for Good, which is trying to set up food hubs around the US and creating models for um, connecting local farmers who need another quick outlet for their production, connecting those local farmers through these refrigerated spaces with residents who are food insecure. And that level of food insecurity is going to get worse because of the big, beautiful cuts to SNAP benefits. So yeah, that to me is where there's a lot of interesting action right now. But happy to talk offline about more ideas with this.
Thanks, Jennifer. Rachel, you want to ask your question, and then this will be the last one.
Okay, thanks. Hope it's interesting. Transportation. If you're in a very car-centric city, I'm in Rochester, New York, public transportation has been gutted. It takes way too long. It's really not viable for, most people. Most people need to have a car to get around. Are there metrics around transportation and mobility?
Yeah, I think absolutely. And so I mentioned earlier that there are census data about commuting and uh, both people who commute from inside your city to a job outside and people who commute from outside to a job in your city. And I think just as a starting place, figuring out ways of bringing down those numbers is important. Um, and inevitably, you kind of circle back to affordable housing because if people can't live there, they're going to have to commute there. Um, but I think you also might, if you have mass transit options, even if there are buses, or kind of, fly-by-night vans, just measuring what their usage is each year might give you a little bit of insight whether efforts to create more mass transit options are working. Um, Also, you could do surveys of people in your community about use of bike and use of, pedestrian shopping and things like that. And I know Department of Transportation used to be a rich source of those data, but after cuts, who knows? Um, but yeah, it's an interesting thing to look at.
Well, thank you everybody for your questions. Thank you, Michael, so much for being willing to tackle this question in an hour, and much more. So again, thank you all for being here. It's just the beginning. We hope we can have other discussions. Follow up with me with your questions. Look for a recording and also get the slides from Michael and all the resources that he shared and you all shared. I'll make sure to compile them and send them along just so we can keep learning together because that's what it's all about. Thank you all for being here again. Have a
Thank
great
you,
rest of your
Jen.
day.
Cheers.